Welcome to the Spectrum Lounge podcast, where we discuss creatives of color disrupting the game in TV, film, and pop culture. I am your host, Rebecca Theodore-Vachon, and on this episode, we chat with producer Khalil Sullivan of Shoga Films as we discuss the Queer Harlem Renaissance project, highlighting the unsung heroes of the LGBTQ artistic community. Take a listen. Welcome, Khalil. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for inviting me to take part in today's show.
Absolutely. I'm so excited about this project. Andre Barnes, who does the publicity for your project, reached out to me. I think like a few weeks ago.
Mm.
And I saw the prospectus, and well, you tell us. You can tell us, what is the Queer Harlem Renaissance project?
So, our project really aims to bring to film all the wonderful lives and stories of particularly the queer Black folk who are involved in the Harlem Renaissance. Many folks think the Harlem Renaissance is just only about Blackness. And what a lot of the research we've done indicates is that it was very much a part of the queer community as well, that there were queer and Black artists doing work that was sometimes overtly queer, sometimes it was kind of on the DL, but it's an active part of the Renaissance.
Great. So, what made you want to be part of this project, and how did this project come to be?
Well, I identify as queer and Black as well. So I really got into the Renaissance during my research in graduate school, and then fell in love with these stories and wish I knew more about the contributions of queer Black individuals in all of American history, but I just found this great pleasure in the Renaissance. And then I met Marcus Harris, who's one of our producers involved in this project and directors of the project, and also Robert Phillipson, who kind of writes the scripts and conceives of some of the ideas and does the research. And it was just a great marriage of people with great intentions and actions and ideas. So that's why I got involved.
Great. It's so fascinating because I lived in Harlem for about 2 to 3 years. I lived like on 125th Street and off of Frederick Douglass, and I like for me, it's like I had an idea of certain queer artists in the during the Harlem Renaissance, but I didn't know that it was so vast.
Yeah.
Like with the singers, like with Bessie Smith, and we had the HBO movie that came out with Queen Latifah, which was great.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but can you tell us more about what you said about like some of the art that we had, that you had some of these artists talking about their queerness that we didn't really know?
Right. So, the latest part of our project focuses on the first truly positive portrayal of homosexual love and desire. And that's Bruce Nugent's prose poem, Smoke Lily's Jade. That was really the first in American letters that had a positive portrayal of queerness. Richard Bruce Nugent was from a kind of elite Washington, D.C. family. He was friends of Langston Hughes. And one day he met Langston, and Langston said, you know what? Things are happening in Harlem. Come on up to Harlem. So we really have Bruce Nugent to thank for just being out and queer. But there were others, like you said, like Bessie Smith. There were songwriters. There were other artists who had to kind of understand how to manage their queerness. But this latest round of our project focuses on Bruce and his amazing prose poem. So that's kind of Bruce is the reason why I'm into the Renaissance, because he's really, I think, is for contemporary queer Black folk. He's the one who looks the most legible to us because he was so unashamedly queer. Um, yeah.
Great. So what other projects? So you have, so this 15-minute doc, you it's described as a prospectus. Is there the plan to create a more of a feature length or a longer
Exactly. The goal is to make a feature-length project. Robert's been doing films for a while, and he had an idea of like, let's do the full documentary about the queer contributions in the Harlem Renaissance. So that's the goal, and we've been breaking up into doing short pieces along the way. So that's the idea. Just do a full project. Now this requires lots of funding and time. So we're trying to building the arsenal of ideas and trying to merge them into one big prospectus to present to people and say, hey, let's get more funding for this kind of thing. Because both Black and queer audiences right now are showing a desire to see our history in this beautiful new light.
Right. It's funny because there were two things that happened. This yesterday, of course, the Pulitzer Prizes were announced,
Yeah.
and I believe history was made because we had our first openly gay playwright when
Yeah.
and that was exciting. I was like, wow. I mean, we still have a ways to go, but this is progress.
Right, right. I
Yeah.
haven't seen his musical. A friend of mine saw it and said, "Oh my god!" And actually, a friend of mine and Robert from Sugar, Robert Phillipson, saw it and said, "Wow, this is the one to see." And I couldn't make it to New York to see it during its airing time, but I was so impressed when I read the news yesterday about the Pulitzer. So yeah.
And then I think Jeremy O. Harris, I think he identifies as queer,
Hmm.
had Slave Play, which was very controversial,
Yeah.
but was getting very positive reviews. I mean, I saw some critiques of it, but for the
Hmm.
most part, I mean, he's definitely made a name for himself, and now he has movie deals and
Hmm.
television deals.
Hmm.
Um, and then the second thing I saw this past weekend. Ryan Murphy has this Netflix series called Hollywood. And
Yeah.
it's basically a what if reimagining of what if we had an industry. It's set in the 40s, and the question is, what if we could have an industry that was, devoid of like racism, sexism, anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And Jeremy Pope plays this openly gay screenwriter, Archie, and he's been getting a lot of positive reviews, and I just love that representation because he was just very unashamed of who he was, and also the fact that he was a sex worker, so he was doing
Mm.
sex work on the side to support his, and I just kind of felt like not only the actor of Jeremy, but it's like even in Hollywood, we still don't really have openly gay. Let's talk on the male side. Openly gay
Mm.
male Black actors. Um, why do you think why what do you think accounts for that? Why a lot of them are still closeted?
Oh, that. Oh, you're asking big questions, but important
Hmm.
questions. I can look at Bruce Nugent's career as a great example. As I mentioned before, like we just done this kind of newer piece based on Smoke, Lilies, and Jade. Bruce was the one of the few openly queer identified, I guess you could say, individuals in the Renaissance, and I don't think things have changed 100 years later.
Hmm.
Bruce was good friends with Wallace Thurman, and they were both in an art collective that they self-called Niggerati Manor, along with Zora
Yeah.
Neale Hurston, author of Their Eyes Are Watching God. Langston Hughes partook in it as well. Aaron Douglas, the artist. They tried to get a literary journal off the ground called Fire. It spectacularly flamed out after one issue because of funding issues. But at the time,
Mm.
they realized that Black folk know about queerness and other kind of non-heteronormative sexualities, but they're sometimes afraid to talk about those things publicly because they're worried about how white folk will see them or how other folk will see them. I think the same thing is happening now. As Black folk, and this is just the real honest truth about being Black, as W.E. Du Bois talks about double consciousness, we have to play this tight walk. Right, we're on a
Mhm.
tightrope, and we have to watch how we think of ourselves, but how other people see us as well. And there's those stereotypes that proliferate about us, and some of those stereotypes are about hypersexuality. And so queerness starts intersecting with hypersexuality. And there's a fear of how people will see us as Black folk. So I think that concern is just still alive for Black folk today. There's stereotypes about hyperviolence, hypersexuality. All these things are still prevalent today. And Black folk are having to walk this tightrope constantly. I think it's happening today still. I just think it's still happening. So you
Right.
mentioned a number of authors who are pushing the envelope. There's also I heard about Tessa Thompson is starring in an adaptation of Nella Larsen's Passing, another
Yes.
queer Black novel written during the Renaissance that kind of deals with it it manages in a very interesting way. And there's Madam C.J. Walker's piece, not openly queer, but her daughter Alelia Walker, who became an heiress of the Madam C.J. Walker fortune, was also openly queer. So we've had this history for a long time, and there are new pieces coming out now. I think as Black folk are trying to sit in their identity and negotiate their
Mhm.
identity from a position of strength now. And I think, in addition, it's the kind of movement of the gay and lesbian movement of the 60s and 70s and kind of the queer aspects of it, the 1990s and so forth. So people are feeling their power. People are feeling their strength now. And they want to see that reflected also in the historical narratives they're being told about them. So I think that's what's happening. There's a small shift happening right now. And the artwork is reflecting that shift in desire from Black folk to say, you know what, we think right now we have the strength to control these narratives and control how we're seeing and manage and negotiate those in a more robust way.
Right. Because I also think about the fact that when we talk about the representation of Black queer folks, particularly on the entertainment side, as far as movies and TV, there's been a lot of criticism about the fact that there's been this sort of erasure,
Mm,
right? That when we think about queer representation, it's usually in the body of like able-bodied, cisgendered,
yeah.
white gay male. That's like the prototype. And what was interesting, I remember a few years ago there was this very interesting conversation. I say interesting, on Twitter, where there's this kind of resentment, right, in the
Mm,
white queer community, as where they feel that, well, Black people are the most homophobic,
mm,
and the whole thing with Prop 8 came out, and I think there was a report that said, there were Black people that voted. There was a certain percentage of Black people that voted against Prop 8 or
mhm,
for Prop 8. And so the idea became, well, it's Black people's fault. It's Black people's fault that we did not get this legislation for
mhm,
gay marriage.
mhm.
And I just found it interesting. I was just like, queer Black people have been here. They've
Yeah,
always been here. There,
yeah,
you can find, homophobia in any community if you
yeah,
really look at it.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so why do you feel that there's this divide as far as like the white queer community and the
So
Black queer
yeah,
community?
so their attack, their critique, first of all, is racist. Let's just call it what it is. To imagine that
Hmm.
all Black people vote and think the same way is just imagining Black people as a monolith. It's imagining that we just kind of walk and talk and do the same thing. We don't. We're a diversity of experiences. We come from different religious backgrounds, different political backgrounds, different class backgrounds. So to imagine that we're going to act and vote, I mean, the same thing happens. Same thing's happening right now in our current 2020 presidential election system. The way the Black vote, quote unquote, is talked about, it's talked about as one body of people thinking and acting and believing and eating and thinking the same way. That's just a
Hmm.
false narrative. It's racist to think of that. Like, part of this
Right.
project has always been the same project of the later Harlem Renaissance artists, which just push intersectionality. They didn't use that term, Kimberly Crenshaw's term, intersectionality, but folks like Bruce Nugent and Wallace Thurman and Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes were saying, you know what? We're not just Black. We're also Black and cis male. We're also Black and cis female. We're also Black and working class. We're also Black and middle class. We're also Black and atheists. We're also Black and sex workers. There's so many dimensions to being a Black person, and we wanted those stories. They wanted those stories to come out. We want to do the same thing. So when those stories can come out, I think the critique from folks outside the Black community who want to be in allyship with it will understand, you know what? You just can't treat the Black community the same way. You have to really engage them on their Blackness and their Blackness and their intersectionality, and found allyship that way. So I think that critique is it's just racist. It's starting off in the wrong place. We are a really diverse group of people.
Right. And how much do you and one of the things that I find so funny is when they try to blame Black people
Mm.
for homophobia. I like to remind them that you guys are the one that brought Christianity to us. Um
Facts.
and
Talk.
if you look at ancient, African civilizations, we definitely see
Yes.
that there were Black queer communities, right? Or Black
Yes.
openly gay people. And then you
Yes.
brought this religion here and then told us that it was wrong. So whose fault
Yes.
is it really?
That's that you have a critique. There you go. You have the answer. Why are you
Yeah.
asking me? You know what's going on. Yes. Yes. No,
Yeah, it's
there's
true.
there's a
And
wonderful text
yeah, it's just weird.
yeah, it's weird. There's a wonderful text I read also in grad school, and if I get too academic, just tell me that, keep it on the DL. But Gloria Vecker,
Hmm.
African Surinamese scholar, so she's out of Suriname, and she did research on the Creole population of Suriname. Suriname was one of the few Dutch colonies in the West. And so they have a population of Creole folks that, ancestors who were enslaved Africans. And at some point, slavery was ended in Suriname, but the Black population remained. And so she did this great research and found a history of women loving women, a practice of women loving women in Suriname amongst the Creole Black women there. So, yes, we have been dealing with non-heteronormative sexualities for a long time as African peoples, as descendants of African peoples. It is the West who has brought this certain conception of heteronormativity and homophobia along with them. And I think a lot of Black communities, I shouldn't say I think, I know, Black communities have for a long time housed heterosexual couples and families. I think every community has. There's just the problem is those stories aren't always on the forefront. Those stories aren't always treated the same way. So
Mhm.
people get it
Uh,
twisted. People misunderstand things.
right. So when I was watching the podcast I'm sorry, the documentary, and you were referring to Niggerati Way, I was thinking of this 2004 film that I saw. It was called Brother to Brother.
Yes, Roddy
And that's
Evans.
how
Yes.
Yes, and that's how I was introduced to Bruce
Hmm.
Nugent, and just this whole idea of like this queer community living in the middle of Harlem. Um, and number one, that was like the first online on-screen portrayal that I had ever seen, or dramatized portrayal I'd seen of Zora Neale Hurston. And then, I thought about like the happy times about how she was part of this community, but then I also thought about the sexism that she also experienced
Yeah.
within that artist community, like when Their Eyes Were Watching God came out, that her work was not respected,
Yeah.
even amongst her black male queer peers.
Yes.
Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about that, about within the community?
Absolutely. So I have the same experience. I saw Brother to Brother in graduate school and was just amazed to have that portrayal. And I had the same reaction, like, "Oh, that's Zora Neale Hurston. Wow, that's beautiful." But it's no surprise. We have also misogyny. We have misogynoir problems, which is kind of it's bias against Black women. And yeah, even the community of even Black gay male authors from that time had their own problem with understanding how sexism and misogyny plays into it. So I think it could be viewed, another way as well. Bruce also had problems of writing openly homosexual content in his novel. Zora will also have problems of writing strong female characters in her works as well. It's reflective of a certain bourgeois value that came out of the Black community, the Renaissance. Black leaders were thinking of the Black community once again as a monolith, as one great body, and they were concerned about what white folks saw of them or how white folks perceived them. And so there was this effort to kind of clean up the Black image through uplift, through social uplift. And at the expense of that were strong women. At the expense of that were queer people, all of whom were Black. And so, yeah, Zora faced that problem. Bruce Nugent faced that problem as an openly queer male. And then within the queer community, the solidarity was an issue. I think it's hard to say what would have been, but we can only hope that now solidarity becomes an important issue. Because I think Black queers of all sexualities and genders need each other to kind of combat things. But yeah, she faced bias from also her Black queer male counterparts. Yes.
And when I think back to like watching the project, the documentary, and I seeing women like Bessie Smith and Gladys Bentley and
Hmm.
Ma Rainey, and I couldn't help but think of like sort of like this parallel today, that when we have like our Black female artists, right? Like those ladies, those artists, women artists back then were just very bold and apologetic and very sexual
Yeah.
and in their art. And
Yeah.
then today I kind of feel like we're still going through the same thing, where like there's this policing of how Black women artists have to present themselves, right? Like for instance,
Hmm.
when we look at Meg the Stallion, or
Yeah.
someone like Lizzo, it's this constant policing of, it's like, well, back in the day, Black women didn't carry themselves that way, they were more respectable. And I'm like, were they really?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we go through cycles. I think so. The moment you're referring to in music history is talked about as the classic blues movement, which was mostly Black female singers with a lot of all male bands. So even Louis Armstrong was actually playing in Bessie Smith's band back in the 1920s before he would have his really big breakout. It was a critical moment because the record industry realized that Black audiences will buy music by a Black artist. And so the record industry had made this huge pivot and said, wow, there's this mass of Black people who are going to buy records no matter what the price. They want their own history. They want to hear their own singers tell their own stories. And the blues became a very popular movement because of that, a very popular genre. So I think Bessie, Ma Rainey, Gladys Bentley, they were on the vanguard and they rode a wave of certain kind of liberal values that kind of got into the industry. The industry was about money. The industry doesn't care about values or morals. They just want some money. And I think Bessie, Ma, Gladys Bentley, they were just being themselves, their wonderful, amazing female and queer selves, and they rode that wave. And so I think we're facing another wave now. And the question is, what kind of wave will we have? Will it be a liberal wave? Will we force record companies to be more responsible? Will we have Black owned record companies that control what kind of art's coming out and that has a diversity of experiences? It depends. Things don't always happen progressively, though. You know, we go in and out of certain values. The pendulum swings to the left, the pendulum swings to the right. And so I think it's a question of where's the pendulum right now? That's the question, really.
Right. And then I also think of, as far as like hip hop, right?
Hmm.
The question had been for years, when are we going to have our first openly gay male rapper, right?
Yeah,
Black male rapper.
yeah, yeah.
And then we had Lil Nas, who's right under our noses, and then came out like I think it was a couple of years ago, where he was just like, duh, if you'd watched that video I won a Grammy for, you guys would have
Right.
known I was pretty much saying that I was
Although,
gay.
let me let,
Do you, yeah,
yeah, let me also
yeah,
rep Frank Ocean though, because Frank came out as bisexual, and everyone started calling him
yes.
gay. And I think that's another thing as
Hmm.
well. There's biphobia within the queer community. Number one,
Mm,
I identify as
hmm.
bisexual, and so sometimes my gay and lesbian brothers and sisters look at me and say, you're a cheater. You're this," and I'm like, "Hang on there." And biphobia is a noted problem within the gay and lesbian movement, and has been since documented in the 1960s. But Frank came out and said, listen, I love both men and women, and that's who I am. And he wrote songs about it. Little Nas X came out as queer, and we appreciate him coming out as gay, and that's amazing too. I think for the longest time, people have been trying to say, I'm not the normal male, hypersexual male that you want me to be. I'm going to put control of that. I think about Little Richard. I think about Prince.
Oh,
Oh, Michael Jackson. Like
right,
the history of Black men saying, I'm going to resist the standard narrative. I'm going to resist this stereotype. I think is long, and it's long been an issue for Black male celebrities and Black male artists. I think of James Baldwin, who said, I'm a Black man out here, and also wrote some very serious homosexual content in his novels. So I think for a long time, Black men have been saying we're going to resist the narrative of what we're supposed to be, that's put out by white America, that's rubber stamped by the upper elite of Black community as well. But yeah, it's a history. It's a history. It's a long history of us saying, hey, we're going to resist this. And the question is, who's listening? Who's listening?
right. I think it's important that you made that distinction between gay and bi, because particularly when it comes to men's sexuality, because I don't know if it's just me, but it does seem to me that sometimes it is, I say this in air quotes here, easier for people to accept a man to be gay as opposed to be bisexual. Like women being bisexual, they're just like, oh, I totally get
Yeah.
that.
Hmm.
But a man being bisexual, they're like, I don't get it. I don't understand.
Yeah. You know what? My own dissertation research about the dandy and the Black dandy is part of that question I have for people as well. I think there's a turn in the 20th century where the idea of what a man was supposed to be became codified. And I'm still trying to figure out like when and why that moment came into being. But there's a question of what a man's supposed to be and what's a Black man supposed to be. And those things are kind of, I think, related a little bit. And I don't know why, but it's a thing. And I think that affects our views of bisexuality amongst men, amongst Black men as well. I think the
Right.
biphobia also plays into it, because I think bisexual Black men are perceived as even more hypersexual than heterosexual Black men, because they have an attraction to both genders or all genders. So I think that's part of it. I think it's super complicated and weird, and it's tied up in our weird gender history in the West. And that Western gender history is imposed upon us as Black folks, as you were saying before, as Black folk in the diaspora. And we're having to negotiate with that. We're having to negotiate that from a different position of power. And it just gets super complicated.
Right. So,
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit more about the catalog? What else you have under the Queer Harlem Renaissance project? So, you have this Prospectus, and what other projects is Shoga Films working on?
Right. So we also have the Congo Cabaret, which was a short that Robert finished in 2018. It was released in March 2018. That was also directed by the Gosfilds, who also directed this prospectus. And that Congo Cabaret is a wonderful adaptation of portions of Claude McKay, Black gay writer of the Renaissance, his novel Home to Harlem. And in that, just like you saw with Ronnie Evans's Brother to Brother, Robert had the idea of like, all right, I'm going to make this documentary about the Queer Harlem Renaissance, but I also need this part that shows people what it was, that's really fun. And Congo Cabaret is that short element of bringing color and life to the historical stuff. So that's a wonderful piece in the collection. And then there's also Mood Lavender, which is a documentary as well, a short documentary that Robert did earlier, that goes along with Congo Cabaret. And the last bit is Taint Nobody's Business, a short documentary released in 2010, excuse me, that features the women singers that we mentioned before, Gladys Bentley, Bessie Smith, and Ma Rainey. So it's been a kind of collection of short documentaries and all these kind of also kind of dramatic pieces, smaller pieces that dramatize the history as well. That's all in the collection.
Mhm. Oh, great. So how did you get, so I know that with the prospectus that we saw with the documentary that was narrated by David Diggs, how did you get him involved with this project?
Yeah, Robert Phillipson, our director, he knows David's father. They're former partners, living in Oakland in
Oh,
the Bay Area, right? So he's known
hmm.
David since David was little, and I think just years ago he said, David, I need a great voice actor for this part, and David says, yes, let's do it. So it's kind of all in the family kind of thing, basically, and it's just these connections that were within Robert's community of queer men that he knew, and David was a son of a queer man that he dated.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And I know Billy Porter is also attached to one of the projects.
Right. Billy came in to narrate Smoke, Lilies, and Jade, and that's through the wonderful context the Gosfields have. The Gosfields are a Black gay film directing and writing couple in Hollywood. And when Robert met them to talk about this project, they said, okay, we're calling up everyone we know. And it was amazing because it was a small budget, but there's so many Black folk and brown folk in the community that, you know what, we want to take part in this kind of work. We think this work is very important. And Billy Porter was one of them. And so we thank him for just realizing the importance of this kind of work to teach people their real history. And it's in step with the work he's doing right now with Pose, which I love. But yeah, the Gosfields reached out to him and he said, yes, I'll do it on scale. And I'm like, wow, that's so generous,
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So tell us, for our listeners, where they can find you on social media and kind of how they can donate to this project, because I really want this made. I really
Yeah.
want this documentary made.
So do I. It'd be
So
so
how?
great.
Yeah.
So they can find us on Instagram, of course, and Facebook. And a lot of the films can be seen on Canopy. Canopy is this wonderful film database that most people have access to because most public libraries have access to Canopy. That's Canopy with a K. And so if you want to see the films, you can go to Canopy, usually through your local library's website, or just go to Canopy's website. And if you just want to follow Shoga Films, find us on Instagram, also find us on Facebook to keep up with the kind of weekly writings we do about current Black art that's in the same kind of wheelhouse and any kind of work we're doing also with our projects currently.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, Khalil.
Thank you. It's been awesome.
Great. Thank you. All right.